Welcome to the Evolutionary Parenting Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Castles, PhD. I am excited for this week's topic because it's one that I actually know virtually nothing about. So this week we're looking at how do we look at dead babies from the past to tell us about parenting practices thousands of years ago, and what can we take from this in our modern world. Now, joining me for this is Dr. Sharon Hellcrow of the University of Otago. She is a bioarchaeologist, and I actually shouldn't say joining me. I should probably say leading the conversation because, again, I couldn't contribute anything to this. So it is more like an intro to bioarchaeology, baby style. So please join me. I am so excited for this conversation, and hopefully we can all leave with a bit more knowledge about how our past can inform our present. Without further ado, Dr. Sharon Hellcrow. All right, I am so excited to have with me today Dr. Sharon Hellcrow. She is an associate professor in biological anthropology at the University of Otago. More specifically, she's a bioarchaeologist with a research interest in all things to do with infants and children. Her research addresses central archaeological questions of the intensification of agriculture and human responses to this seminal time in prehistory, with a regional interest in prehistoric Southeast Asia and South America. She manages the skeletal analyses on several international archaeological projects in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, China, and Chile, and also has an interest in the ethics of bioarchaeology. Or, as she puts it in more simplistic terms, which I like, she studies dead babies from the past. So thank you for being on.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Kia ora, that means hello from New Zealand. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I follow your wonderful mahi, your work, with interest. It informs my understanding of infancy and childhood work in the past, obviously. And I hope that mine's relevant for listeners today and for you also, Tracy.
I am so excited by this because, you know, as I said to you before, I have usually people on where I have a sense of what they do. And I have a sense of some of their, I have no idea about this. It is just fascinating to me, just the sheer idea that you can look at, dead babies and learn so much about parenting and everything from times that we just don't have access to. And I find that just mind-blowing and fascinating. So, let's start with, how did you get into this field? Where does this come from? Because it doesn't seem like something I hear little kids saying at, 5 and 6, I want to study dead babies. So where did you...
Yeah, no, I've always had a love for biology throughout schooling, but I also really liked, when I went to university, social theory and evolution that I did in high school. I started my tertiary education at Auckland University in New Zealand as well, and I had really excellent mentors up there who really stimulated my interest in archaeology. So things like looking at material artifacts from the past to tell something about people's past lives, and also in biological anthropology. But it wasn't until I made my way down to Otago, where I am now, and stayed there, which is the best, university in New Zealand and closest university to the South Pole, Antarctica, and most beautiful. I took a bioarchaeology class, and in that class we got to handle the bones from these people who'd bequeathed their bodies to the anatomy department. And I really got hooked on the practical aspect of actually being able to read the bones and tell something about, their identity, how they lived, and their experience during life. And my mentor, Associate Professor Nancy Taylor, was amazing. She invited me to Thailand for an excavation project. Just after my fourth year at university, and it was a really exciting prehistoric site, and that really started my journey in Southeast Asian bioarchaeology. So very, very blessed to have been given all those opportunities, and it was just by chance really that I got interested in looking at infants and children. Nancy actually gave me a topic for a fourth year dissertation, like a small research project looking at that. And then I just kind of went on and, expanded my interest around that topic.
That's so cool. And so are you in the field a lot? Like, do you have to travel a lot for the field work there?
Yeah, we do travel a lot, and in the past, when we did archaeological projects overseas, say in Southeast Asia, we'd bring the bones back, but things change, and we realise, actually, this is their cultural
Yeah.
biological heritage. Those stay there. So we do a lot of work overseas. So it does make it difficult in terms of family life, but very rewarding as well. My children come over with me, and they love to learn different languages and experience different cultures. And I've made lifelong friends over there. So yeah, we do a lot of traveling. Obviously, not at the moment,
But
which is a bit hard for research, but
yeah, what do you do? And I mean, in a pandemic, yeah, if you can't get, it's like not being able to run a study for a psychologist. You have but they could do it all online. So they're
yeah,
able to,
I
but you
mean, a lot of
can't.
the work that I do write, and I think we were talking about it the other day, some of my work looking at bridging evolutionary theory and bioarchaeological theory and care, a lot of it's social theory, so I can draw on a lot of other work. So I like to do syntheses for the discipline that I hope will be of interest to other researchers. But we are writing up papers based on previous data that we've got, but I
Okay.
am itching to get back into the field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get a bit more of an understanding of bioarchaeology as its own thing, because you've mentioned biological anthropology, these other areas, and those are areas a lot of listeners and myself are a bit more aware of. So, can you tell me a bit of both? How is bioarchaeology distinct from biological anthropology, but also how does it complement? Because you talk a lot about having these fields, like one of the papers that, we'll kind of get into, but having these fields that need to merge as almost complementing each other to give us a fuller picture. So what does that look like? And what do people need to understand about bioarchaeology in this framework?
Yeah, well, but biological anthropology is obviously a very broad subdiscipline of anthropology. It's a study of people using biology or concepts of biology and human behaviour, so it uses a biosocial approach. And bioarchaeology, in a broader sense, refers to the study of human skeletal remains from the archaeological context, where we also use this biosocial approach. So we're just really a tiny segment, I suppose, of biological anthropology. And as archaeologists or anthropologists, we're interested in archaeological questions about past, biological adaptation to the environment. So, questions like the development of agriculture, industrialization, climate change, the emergence of social inequality, and the impacts that had on people in the past. So really, a lot of the work that we do is similar to, say, paleoanthropologists, but we're just working to tell people stories from the past, but from different time spans.
So if I understand this correctly, it is like, I guess this is okay. No, I have to understand this better. When
Yeah.
it comes to you get these bones, you get a story, you're able to tell something about their lives from it. How do you then map that onto a social understanding? Like, it seems like I get the biology, you can learn how healthy they were, age, all this kind of stuff is there from the bones. Where do you get from the bones to the behaviors, the practices? How
Yeah, I
do
mean,
you map that?
that's a great question, and it's something that we struggle with a bit more in prehistory compared with historical
Yeah.
human remains, because we've obviously got a really rich cultural, social context that we can draw on from historical documents. So it does get a little bit harder when we go back into prehistory. There are various things that we can do. So looking at individuals' biological sex, and
Yeah.
obviously we've then assumed that that may tie up with their gender, things like that. Looking at health, males versus females. We can also look at age or age identity, which is a social aspect, obviously, and see how people fare across the lifespan. So And we can also use a lot of the social context from the archaeological analysis, so looking at pottery vessels and other types of things that may have been included in the grave to try and tell something about their individual's identity. But yeah, it's much easier to be able to look at those social things, including like looking at, childcare and all that kind of thing, when
Yeah.
you've got more information from historical documents.
Well, and that actually raises a question for me because you study dead babies, so young children, infant bones and stuff. Already there's something so, I mean, it's devastating because they died young. It's not like you get access to this. So already there's something else that is kind of abnormal from
Mm,
a life history perspective going on there.
yeah.
And how does that affect? Because, the practices may be harder. Are they harder to understand from that perspective of
Yeah,
seeing
I mean,
dead
that's
babies?
yeah, we always acknowledge that obviously when we're looking at the very young, that they are a biased,
Yeah.
group of individuals who something has gone wrong somewhere.
Yeah.
So we always have to think about that when we're interpreting our data. What we can also do is look at childhood experience from adults. So we can look at things like um, diet through doing incremental sampling of chemicals that have been incorporated into their
Mhm.
teeth, for example, or their bones, and we can look back on what happened to them during childhood.
Okay. So then you can use the adults to kind of give you a bit of a better picture of what would have been normative, and then I guess assess how the baby bones might be different from that
Yeah,
at that point of
yeah,
what you might expect to see
yeah,
what's going on.
yeah. And there's general things as well that we can tell about, say, childhood mortality. So if we're looking at the number of individuals who died during infancy or, preterm or, early childhood. Just as today, the World Health Organization, unfortunately, uses statistics of,
Yeah.
mortality of under fives to rank populations in terms of health. We do similar types of things.
Okay.
It also gets a little bit more complicated when we're looking at the number of babies that died in the past, because that's related to fertility. It's not necessarily related to ill health. So obviously, the more babies that mothers are having, the more that are going to be included in the cemetery sample. So it gets quite complex.
Tell me more about that. I am like, I hadn't even thought
It's
about the
a,
fertility piece, but
yeah, it's a conundrum. It's a conundrum, and we try and look at as many facets as possible from the society, so including like number of infants and children who died and the age structure of those, different types of pathology that they're experiencing. We look at the size of the overall cemeteries, but again, that's quite hard because we can't necessarily go and excavate entire cemeteries. Would be our entire lives doing that. So there's a lot of different factors that we have to keep in mind. And yeah, I think that most of the literature shows that it's fertility, which we're interested in as well. Fertility change with, the agricultural transition
Mhm.
has more of an effect on mortality statistics than actual health can.
So is it like more fertility, more mortality, or yeah?
So if you have higher fertility, you'll have more babies being born, so you have a more chance that they'll actually be included in the cemetery sample.
Okay. Oh my God. It is. That's so many. It's like so many variables all at
Yeah,
once.
no,
Like
so
kind of.
we're trying to tell stories about the past, and finding the most parsimonious explanation for those is, and some people don't necessarily like the fact that you can't tell definitively, but I think it's really important that we say, within our science that, it could be this, but an alternative explanation is this as well. And then methods change, we might be able to tease those questions apart more and find out.
What's, I love that. That is so. Let's go to one specific area that you've talked about because I get this. The weaning. This is something that I know I've read in more historical, not the prehistory weaning age, but like I know it's in the teeth. Tell me first a bit more how you assess this, because I do want to understand. I know it's usually teeth, right? Is that what you're looking at, teeth for it?
Yeah, teeth are really useful. We can also look at bone, but teeth are really useful because we know that they form at distinct time periods. So, and they preserve very well in the archaeological context because teeth, of course, they have to be very hard. They're highly mineralized. So we can look at the chemicals within the teeth to try and figure out what people were eating, and also, um, how long they may have been breastfed, and when they started to get supplementary food, and when the um, weaning process finished, because we know generally it's a long process. If you want, I can go into the
Yeah,
chemistry.
how do you tell that? Like, what
Yeah,
is in
so
our teeth that
we've
says, oh,
got
this baby's eating some solids, this one's still just on breast
yeah,
milk?
yeah. So we can look at what are called stable isotopes. We can look at carbon and nitrogen. They're often used in archaeological studies because these elements provide insights to dietary patterns. So carbon and nitrogen um, isotope values relate to foods people consume during life. We are what we eat, essentially, and those are preserved in the skeletal tissues. So carbon provides information on like broad kind of groupings of plants based on their photosynthesis pathway. So different paths have different um, isotope signatures, shall we say. And nitrogen isotope data relates to protein consumption. And so you have an enrichment in nitrogen as you kind of rise through the food chain. So top predators will have, a stepwise incremental enrichment in nitrogen. So babies that exclusively consume breast milk, they have a positive offset of nitrogen compared with their mothers. Okay, they're like little carnivores essentially, because they're eating the mother's tissue. They're eating
Yeah.
the milk that is produced by the mother's tissue. So if we can compare the mother's nitrogen levels, sorry, the proxy for a mother's nitrogen level. So we'll look at all the females, for example, adult females within a site, which is problematic, right? Because they don't all eat the same thing, but we take the average, and then we can compare the baby's nitrogen isotopes to see how that relates. And growing infants obviously require dietary supplementation from around the age of 6 months, give or take. And then you get the new dietary components being added into supplement or complement the breast milk. And then eventually they'll start to consume a diet that's more similar to the adults around them. And we can see that by, the introduction of different types of plant foods like staples, say rice or millet, wheat. And we can see that the carbon isotope levels can change as well.
Wow. That is,
Yeah. So,
you just,
and this is yeah, there's a lot of assumptions around the various things that we do in archaeology. We know we've got sampling issues.
yeah. Well, yeah, you don't know whose
For
mom
example.
who's the
Yeah,
mom,
true.
whose baby belongs to
Yeah,
who to make that. But it's fascinating. And I never had thought about the fact that, my God, my children are eating my tissue. That is, that is a whole new way to think about breastfeeding now. So, in general, when you do this, what is the general weaning pattern that you've seen in prehistory? Like, when does it generally end? How long? Because we often talk about, full term nursing, or what is, everyone wants to know what's a worldwide average, what's a historic, and I don't think obviously we have it. It's obviously a range, but what do you find in these prehistory samples where, of course, there weren't, as far as I know, you didn't have formula or anything like that to go on. So what was a common pattern of breastfeeding there?
Yeah, I mean, there's been, very early bottles that have been found in Europe and all that kind of thing. But there most of the work that I do is in Asia or Southeast Asia, and
Yeah.
also doing some work in the Pacific. And what we generally find from the isotopic analysis, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they stop breastfeeding at the time that it isotopically shows, because it just may only contribute to, say, 20% of your diet.
Okay.
You may still breastfeed for a long, long period of time till you're 8, or, whatever. But it may be, less than 20 or 30% of the consumption of your calories. So it won't necessarily show up isotopically, right? But generally, between 2.5 to 4 years of age, we can see isotopically. Some of our work in China found this, and
Okay.
similar kind of time patterns as well, around 3 years of age in Chile.
Okay.
But again, there's variables as well. There's variation between individuals, so it's something that's it's very individual to someone's experience, the
Yeah.
mother's experience in the baby's experience. But generally, yeah, and personally, from having children who breastfeed, I think
It,
that breastfeeding beyond 2 years is quite feasible.
I'm still nursing a 5-year-old right now. So,
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah,
think
I
it's
know.
coming to an end,
Right, just
but
speaking about it makes me want to relactate. But so, it is, yes, I can say that. It is a very normal thing to have
yes.
this so-called extended breastfeeding, as
I
you know.
I love what you said though. And I think I've always heard these kind of ages of 2.5, 3 that seem to crop up as an average as really being the end of weaning. But I find it fascinating to now hear that that may not be the case, that it's just the proportion of kind of caloric intake coming from it we can
Yeah,
no longer
so
see.
there may be some small, there may be some, a nighttime food to get your baby to sleep or
Yeah.
whatever.
And
Which makes total sense because it's just the easiest thing to do, and it's
yeah.
the most, for kids, it must be lovely.
Yeah, right. That is it.
Yeah,
But it's really interesting to think about that because it's true. Beyond that age, I found in both my kids, my daughter went to somewhere between 6 and 7. I missed it. It's suddenly because I had the younger one, realize, oh yeah, you've stopped. I don't quite know when, but it's been a while. Okay. But it was not very, it was comfort. It was when hurt or upset. It was such an occasional thing that, yeah, from a biological perspective of someone studying her body, it probably would be so negligible.
yeah,
But the emotional impact certainly wasn't negligible. The emotional connection and having that time there was obviously really important.
yeah,
So that's really interesting. And I love hearing that now, that it kind of puts that 2.5, 3 just kind of on the shelf over there as an age at which it's more about the amount of food you're getting from it. But that's really interesting too. From that perspective, I think about parents today being told that, you know, they need past 6 months breast milk's not important, or past a year it's not important. But it sounds like it actually had a decent part of their diet up to that age is really what we're saying. It wasn't just that it happened, it was significant enough for their caloric intake
yeah.
that it's
So be able
showing
to
up.
see it. Yeah, yeah. So I don't think it was something that was ever withheld.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah,
So, yeah, when we think about that for parents today, I'm like, yeah, because some people worry that my baby's getting too much breast milk and not enough other food. But it sounds like from a historical perspective, we're like, your baby's fine. That's, it's a compliment. You can have more like complementary foods plus this. So,
yeah,
one of the findings that you had that I want to talk about here is this sex difference in weaning and socialization. So, you in one of your papers talk about in the central Jiao period that you found sex differences in weaning and socialization. And again, we're going to go, obviously, I know now that there's a lot of, we're telling a story, we're trying to tell a story that we're guessing from. What were the differences? What is this story? What is the sex difference story here in terms of these behaviors? Because I know I've heard differences in breast milk, like from a biological anthropological perspective, we see breast milk has differences based on child sex and all these other features. So, but weaning, I had not thought about that process being different. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll talk about some of the work that we've been doing as part of a large project in Central Plains of China. I just wanted to mention Dr. Melanie Miller. She's doing this stable isotope analysis. She's a postdoc at Otago and over in Berkeley. And we're doing this in collaboration with Doreen Yu and Kate Petronkina from City University of New York. And we're really interested in investigating the inception of social inequality, because previous work at this time had shown that there were sex differences in health indicators and diets between adults, male and female adults, in the Bronze Age dynasties compared with early populations. But we thought it's, really important to look at when this started in childhood to understand this across the entire life course, because we can only really understand, adult experience by understanding what's happened in childhood, because it has lifelong repercussions, as you know. So we're looking now again at the chemistry of the bones and the teeth of infants and children that formed in childhood of the adults to ascertain their dietary life histories. The Zhou dynasty came into power about 1046 BC and maintained political control over large territories of north central China hundreds of years. But it was really interesting because you start to find this social stratified and centralized forms of power with kings and nobles and regional rulers versus commoners. And from the previous bioarchaeological evidence from health, we start to see some kind of, sex differences happening here in terms of treatment, in terms of socialization. So Melanie's done some amazing work. She analysed, we're a little bit constrained. Obviously, the work that we're doing is destructive, and as archaeologists, we're all about preservation. So, it's hard to get an enormous sample, but we're really blessed to be able to analyse 23 individuals from 2 different archaeological sites. And we looked at boys and girls, and we found that the girls were fed differently to the boys. The boys seemed to have a diet with more millet, whereas girls had more rice. And we can start thinking about food as being preferred food, prized food, and socialization there. So I think that we're seeing, some of the earliest forms of social inequality between men and women could have been emerging at that time.
What is the difference? Like, I can't eat grains. So the millet versus rice, then I'm assuming obviously rice is pretty nutritionally void. We know that. It was millet just
I think
better?
millet is probably more prized. So it's just showing you that there's a gendered use of food here. So, and food is obviously the best form of looking after individuals. And there may have been other socialization processes as well. Yeah.
Wow. So what other, can I ask what other socialization things you might think go into that? Like when we see this kind of health inequality in children. So already you're setting the stage. What do you think, from examining other elements there, do you think is going on from more behavior? Like this link of this dead babies to the behavior going on here is what would that typically go along with in terms of other?
There could be a lot more work that's done from these archaeological sites, which have already been, a lot of them have already been excavated. There's some new analyses that we can do to do like sex determination through peptide analysis of teeth. So the really young babies that we weren't able to do a sex estimation before, we can figure that out. It will be really interesting to look at mortality profiles, so to see whether there are more babies who are female versus male and that type of thing. And there's so much more we could do in terms of dietary analysis as well. Expanding our sample sets would be a really good thing. And also looking at childhood disease, so looking at paleopathology.
Okay. Wow. It's amazing how much you can glean from one tooth. Like you get a tooth and here's a history. So in general, like you've talked a bit about how we kind of go from dead babies to parenting practices here, but you had this paper, The Care of Infants Past, Bridging Evolutionary, Anthropological, and Bioarchaeological Approaches. And you talk about the need to do more in terms of understanding this link. And I love you mentioned there's a framework in terms of studying people with disabilities in the past. And I admit I got my back up a bit when I first said we need to view caring of infants as a disability. And that's not a disability, but I get it now. When you went in to explain, it really is like that. So how do you see getting this perspective going, how to assess it? And I mean, from a more fundamental question, why has the mother-infant dyad been ignored for so long in this field? It feels like, are we not central to evolution, given that this is how we all got here? So,
yeah, I think that the mother-infant dyad and caring, nurturing has been a really important part of, developing an idea about our deep evolutionary past. Paleoanthropologists have always looked at this and they've always put it as a central factor. I think in terms of bioarchaeology, the reason that the mother-infant dyad hasn't been looked at much is reflective of our own society biases. Bioarchaeology, paleopathology, so looking at disease in the past, is we're looking for data, we're looking for scientific observations, and we may not find, for example, any pathology on infants and children. We may not find, as you talked about before, a mother and a baby being buried together. That's very unlikely.
Okay.
But I think it does. I sound like a raging feminist, which I am. I think
it's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
No, it's a great thing. I think it's a great thing. I think it's because mothers' work, so caring, looking that type of thing, is still considered natural somehow. It's something that's not skilled, it's not complex. And we all know this has been criticised since the 1970s and earlier. And as you said before, we spend more time writing and thinking about the care of animals in the past in archaeology than the care of children. But kids made up a really large amount of proportion, I should say, of past communities. And a lot of people would have engaged with that work, of all ages, so lots of alloparenting going on. From brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, grandparents, and everyone else in the community. And so I think it's really central to understanding past societies and lifeways. I mean, it was a lot of past work, labor, and people are really interested in looking at metalworking.
Yeah, and it's like
you've got that physical thing that you can look at. So a lot of the but so what got me thinking about this framework was the great work by Lorna Tilley looking at disability in the past, and it's something that really needed to be done. But of course, a lot of the disabilities are invisible. A lot of the individuals that she and others have looked at are very you have to have that pathology on the bones, which you don't always have.
That's true.
But I found her model really useful to compare with the model of care of childhood, and just really an argument of why we should look at childcare in the past, how much work it actually takes.
Can you
try and convince, use a model that's already, accepted, and people are jumping on this. So yeah, and people have been starting to look at it. So hopefully I've contributed something.
So can you share a bit about the model, just so that people understand what model you're talking about, what it means?
So the model from Lorna Tilley's perspective is a 4-stage model. So, and it's really good because it starts us thinking about the individual within the biosocial context. So looking at their bodies within a social, cultural context. So the first stage is looking at, how old the individual was, different things about their identity, the archaeological context, the time period. The second part is looking at pathology. So looking at if there's any evidence for pathology, doing a differential diagnosis. Then the third stage is looking to see whether that individual would have required care for long-term survival. And then the fourth step is looking at the types of care that's needed and thinking about the social context of care, how people were responding to the individual and how the individual was responding to the carers. So it's really great framework and lots of people are now using it. So it's fantastic. When I wrote this paper, I really wanted to go into explaining why the care of infants and children is also important to look at. And this is partly because Lorna Tilley said that the caring of young isn't as complex as caring for an individual with severe disabilities. They are very different types of care, and the time frames are different because, as you know, children develop, so the types of care that they need will change over time. But looking at the model, looking at the type of care and response that someone with this, so-called severe disability has, I argue that infants, they're so altricial, they need so much, they're so vulnerable, they need 24 hours care, they can't control their temperature, they can't feed themselves, they can't hold their heads up.
Yeah.
They need to be rocked to sleep. They need 100% of their nutrition from their mother or others in the society who may be feeding them. So it was just, so I just want to explain that I do really appreciate Lorna's work, but I thought it was really important to also talk about infant care and try and make it visible because it has been really invisible. And I think that that's a gender problem.
I agree. Like, to me, it makes sense that you would have to look at infant care in this. I mean, because again, just from an evolutionary perspective, we're not here if babies aren't cared for. Like, there is a degree of just practicality here that is central. And I always think I did a continuing education program through, we live close to a Haudenosaunee reserve, right? So it's, and I did a care there. They talked about the culture and just this framework of at the center is the culture. Right outside that are the children. They are central with everyone looking in. And then around that are the mothers, and then the care around and it works its way back. And yeah, it made sense. She explained that, of course, children were central. Children were, outside of culture, the most important thing, because that is your future. Like, that is our survival. Without our offspring, we don't survive. There goes your culture. There is, everything else is dependent upon the care of children. So when you have this model and you're talking about linking, this evolutionary anthropology with the bioarchaeology, how does this look? Like, what are you taking from each, and how do we get to say, you can look at food and we use that as a proxy for care, but what about things like emotional care, about the type of comfort and this that are so central to this piece of caring for an infant? How do you get to that in these fields? What do you put together to get there?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that we can never know, but I mean, we can look at ethnographies and look at, and then there's problems, obviously, looking at so-called traditional societies and how they care, looking at, the amount of times that, infants are fed, that they're never put down, those types of things. Even, the evolutionary stuff is really important for bioarchaeology because it starts getting us to think about how human babies are unique compared with other baby primates, non-human primates. They're so vulnerable. So even just accepting that in the requirements of care should mean that we acknowledge that. We acknowledge the labour force that goes into that. And obviously the survival of the species.
Yeah.
We can look at other things as well from an evolutionary context. We can look at things like helping of women during labour, during childbirth, when that developed, how that's really important, and how if traditional ideas about labour or medical care is withheld, the devastating effects that can have, and that's related to, changes which happen in the placenta during evolutionary development. We need that, and we've got these social skills, whether they're traditional birth midwife methods or medical methods to help with that type of thing. So I think that, anthropology is great because we've got these different fields, but sometimes I think it's just so we're just talking to each other. We don't necessarily think about what we could bring in to help us understand people in the past from these other means. So I think it's always really important to keep in mind, whether it's archaeology, whether it's paleoanthropology, whether it's social anthropology, it's really important for us to think about care in babies from, more than a four-field approach. You can even look at psychology, and other things like that.
I like what you said about that, though, that you need all these different fields and they do complement each other in this. I want to ask about one of the things, and it's not in this paper, but I am fascinated by it from just a general history question. Is this use of agriculture? Because everything I've read recently suggests that although it has been a positive in many ways for humans, it also may have been a bit of a downfall for us as well. And, you mentioned, and I may be extrapolating here, but, that rise of inequality that comes about that you start to see, was that linked with, what has been the effect of agriculture on us as humans, but also as parents and the well-being of children here? That is, what have you found? Can you answer all of that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we need to do more work into it because I'm really interested in looking at the origins and intensification of agriculture. There's kind of a popular belief that, we're all agricultural societies today, or most of us are. We're reliant on that, it's given us means to have surplus, and have society as it is today. But we forget that half of our society is actually living in really overcrowded and sanitary living conditions. So we've got overpopulation, we've got lack of resources for part of a lot of the world's population, and they don't have access to nutritional foods, clean water, that type of thing. So while it does give some people that surplus, it doesn't necessarily give other people that surplus. So obviously a lot of that, social disparities come about from after industrialization, but it had the beginnings with the development of agriculture. And you see what happens with societies, before some societies, before they developed agriculture, they weren't sedentary, they weren't living in the same place. But agriculture allowed some societies to maintain a sedentary lifestyle. And then you've got the potential of having a bigger population, a rise in fertility, potentially, and more unsanitary living conditions, ultimately. So it doesn't have a good effect necessarily on the health of individuals if you look at it from that perspective, or modern days perspective. It's interesting that you talk about parenting, and there hasn't been too much looked at in that context. There are things that we can look at in terms of archaeological material artifacts, including the way the babies were carried. Sometimes you may have carrying stuff, carrying them on their back or their front.
Okay.
So, and some people argue that those came around in certain parts of the world for women and men to be working and having babies on their back. Their arguments also problematic, because I think babies are always carried.
Yeah, I was about to say, I'm not sure.
More likely carried on their backs. But some of these things do pop up in the archaeological record around the time that you've got more intensive agricultural practices. But yeah, it's a big area that people haven't necessarily looked at very much. And there's been a lot of assumptions about the division of labour, how that division of labour occurred during the agricultural transition. So women are staying at home looking after the kids, and men are out, tending
farming
to the farm. It's like man the hunter, woman the gatherer, So, yeah. So there obviously needs to be a lot more work put into that. I mean, today you see women out doing a lot of gardening in fields in northeast Thailand. So these things need to be looked at a critical eye. Yeah.
So in terms of looking at like something like those sex differences you found in the Central Zhao period, what when you compare, if you have those teeth or differences from non-agricultural like histories before, do you see a lot of sex differences, or does that kind of I'm going to say gendered, because it really, I think it's sex inequality, but it maps more onto the gendered inequality. Do you see that in pre-agricultural dead babies? Do we see as much of that, or does that kind of inequality seem to stem more from an agricultural period on?
Yeah, we find that we've got more of the sex differences occurring during the agricultural period. There needs to be more work done, this is in China, but there needs to be more work done in Southeast Asia. We don't have a lot of Neolithic cemeteries, so the Neolithic period they're obviously agricultural, but we don't have necessarily many pre-Neolithic, pre-agricultural cemeteries, and it's probably because there was a change in society during that time, and they started to bury in these places. So there's a lot that we can't necessarily tell the difference. We can't really do a comparison of, pre and post agricultural. But we can look at the intensification of the agricultural process.
Okay. And so do you see that as it gets more intense, you do see more inequality building even across that time frame?
We're finding that in China, definitely.
Okay.
And Melanie's going to be doing some more work looking at later periods in China too. So that will be really interesting to look to see whether those sex differences are more extreme
As it goes on. Do you find, I mean, I know you generally work in China there, but you also have these other sites in Chile and other places. What are some of the similarities across it? Because these are different cultures, like vastly different histories. And, even at that point, that long ago, they still would have been very different. But what are some of the overlaps that you see between these different cultures in terms of babies and their development and the way we might assume parenting goes between them?
Yeah, what was really interesting, I think, in the Chilean work, so we work in the Atacama Desert, Dr. Charlotte King was a postdoc, and she did this isotopic work, and we're working with Bernardo Ariaza and Vivian Standen, who are academics in Chile. And we were doing a comparison of infant feeding and weaning practices during the development of the agricultural process, and we didn't necessarily find that there was any major differences over time from the pre-agricultural to the post-agricultural. It was only when we found really intensified agricultural process at the end of the cultural periods that there were any major differences. And we also found amazing variability in weaning practices. So there's so much intra-individual trends in weaning times, the timing of the food, timing that the food's being introduced, different types of foods that are being weaned onto. So that was very, very interesting. But there's also an issue with looking at these chemicals, the isotopes, because they can be affected by physiological stress. So I think some of the things that we're seeing in terms of the nitrogen profiles were actually evidence for physiological systemic stress. So it's not always as clear cut as we want it to be. So what happens is you start catabolizing your body tissue. So if you go into a state of malnutrition or famine, so things like that could have been happening if you're really, really sick.
And of course, with babies, as we talked about, something went wrong at some point there. So they might be more prone to something like that. That is, it's so difficult, but it's so fascinating. I mean, it's just...
Now, the more work we do, the more questions we have. So
right? It's
lovely talking with you, because, you think about these things all the time, but it's getting the interest from, the outside, from the discipline, that we can really start to think about other things that are important to others,
that go in there. Because
as well.
It's so, I mean, just in general here, I find this all fascinating from just even an academic perspective, so to say. It's all there. But I think it's also really important for a parenting perspective for today's parents. Like, I think that when we understand our past history, it helps explain why we might have certain practices that we do. Even just thinking about, we often talk about inequality as if almost it's this modern problem that we have, when in reality, as you're telling me, it goes way back, even for babies there. So how do you link, like, for people to understand why they should care about the past, not just from an academic perspective, but in terms of informing or helping us, it may not inform, but to help us understand modern parenting? How do you see the link between our parenting in the past and parenting today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we can only really understand where we are today by understanding where we came from. We have to understand our history, we have to understand our prehistory and our evolution. I mean, as we were talking about before, the whole survival of our species is based on the care of the young, and especially of infants. They are so altricial. They're in a state requiring so much nurture and care, compared with all other primates. And we have developed a lot of social mechanisms to help to do all that work. But a lot of these mechanisms that were developed in the past have been broken down today. So, if we want to call them Western societies, a lot of single parent families, a lot, and nuclear families, or even thinking about low income families. There has to be an acknowledgement that caring for infants and children is the most important job we can do as humans, in my opinion. And if we think of it from an evolutionary sense and from social history sense, a child requires extreme energy expenditure, and to understand the dire effects or the outcomes socially and in terms of health if that diet somehow is disrupted, and things go wrong for both the mother and baby. So there's a lot of structural inequalities that's kind of making it really hard for some people in society to try and look after their kids the most easy way that they can, for the kids' outcome. And, there's schooling, there's health interventions and all that kind of thing that governments and other organisations do. But I think thinking about extended community and allo-parenting and help, social monetary help as well, is really important. And just general valuing of parents.
Absolutely.
And their mental health.
Yeah, because it's true. Like we do, and it's always that cliche, it takes a village to raise a child, but it really does. It takes this support and community around. How do you, sorry, just out of curiosity, do you get a sense of, in your work and looking at the archaeological element of it, how to determine the type of shared care, the allo-parenting, the allo-care there was in history? Or is it just that we assume it's there because of the cultures, or is there evidence from what you've dug up, I haven't done anything, to understand how that was structured?
No, this is the thing. In prehistory, we can look at things, from the archaeological context, if they've got shared housing and that type of thing, those type, but generally we are using models that have been developed from ethnographic work.
Okay. And that makes sense though. That is that bridging of what you said, taking all these different fields and having to look at.
We can look at, kind of maybe size of families. If we think about fertility, but those are kind of nuclear family ideas. We can look at, we can start to look at post-marital residence and that type of thing to see if you've got matrilocal or patrilocal residence and the effect that might have on children. But it is very hard when you go back further in the past.
Yeah.
But without a doubt, there would have been extended help for children.
Yeah.
And you just see it today. I mean, when I go over to northeast Thailand and work there, it's really hard work in terms of, for me, it's the heat and the humidity and looking after my kids and, traveling and doing all that strenuous stuff. But it's also like a holiday because they'll just come and my friends will just come and whisk my children away. I'm just like, or if I'm
that
eating,
sounds lovely.
I know, if I'm eating, my friend will come in, when the kids were little, and pick them up and go and, show her the, the trees or the birds or whatever. And, wow, wouldn't that be amazing?
It's so interesting because, it's funny because you talking about that makes me think how you've looked at this culture, you've seen this shift towards inequality and everything that started years ago within those cultural locations, but yet that shared care is still more prominent today. Somehow over that.
The shared care is in the Thailand context.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't spent time in China in that context.
I guess it's true. Although we do seem to have some evidence, at least like when we look at, the grandparents taking care of kids, and that's more prominently identified.
And rituals, say, around new women that have just given birth, and the amount of time that they may need, to heal and just be with baby and be taken care of,
Yeah, as opposed to a place like the US where people are sometimes back at work 3 days later after having a new baby, which is
the most traumatic thing that I could ever could experience.
I feel like I was talking to a friend about this actually the other day, and I feel like what is done to mothers with that separation from a biological perspective, it's like you've lost your baby.
Yeah.
Like your body is now expecting to have this proximity and this time, and that's being taken away. And that is psychologically devastating, I think. Like
Yeah,
that is
psychologically devastating, and in terms of the mother-infant dyad and hormones and stress,
yeah,
it is horrible.
it
I mean, I went back to work quite early, but I had the luxury of scooting over to a nursery that was really close, and they're amazing there. But I was talking to my friend yesterday about it, and I said that it's the most traumatic time in my life. I've actually got post-traumatic.
I'm not surprised. Like
Yeah,
I
it's
feel
just
like
the amount, even just trying to express. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Whereas, in the past, this wouldn't have in some societies it wouldn't have been necessary. Yeah, I think we're so lucky to have been an era where we've got antibiotics, for mastitis and all that kind of thing. Because I don't know if I could have fed some of one of my children. But they also had shared allo nursing, allo breastfeeding, which would
I
have helped.
actually have Dr. Palmquist coming on in April to talk about that because I saw
It
in
was,
your
yeah,
book she's got a chapter on that.
Yeah, Anthropology does amazing work looking at
Yeah,
that and
I
just
am.
normalizing it,
Yeah,
because it is normal. It's
it,
totally normal, and I could see how, it's really important,
you know,
and there's, obviously shared milk practices and that kind of thing. Um, yeah, so I think it's hopefully becoming more accepted.
it makes me think actually about one of I know it's a struggle in your work of we don't know who mom is, and when you're doing those analyses, you take the average. But I mean, depending on how common the shared milk, it's almost like they're eating all the moms going on. So that average might actually be a better
Yeah,
sense of
yeah,
what's
yeah,
going
yeah.
on.
That's a
Uh,
point.
Yeah, I'm like, hey, you kind of just solved one of your little problems there. Is just expect mass allo nursing, and that's
Yeah,
what goes there. So
yeah.
yeah, I see. But it is interesting to think though, like even within the Thai context, do you see the inequality early in those sites too, or to do with agriculture or
The
not?
Thai context is quite different. It's quite interesting in a way, because I think that you've got a really, in terms of looking at agricultural development, it's a bit different. It wasn't as fast as some other places in the world, because you've got a multitude of natural resources. You've got, fish and lots of, small animals. You've got um, you've got plants and fruits and insects that people were eating. They don't necessarily need rice. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
It was a bit slower in terms of social disparity. We do see that there is kind of a big change later in the Iron Age, so after the Bronze Age, which is interesting in terms of health change, but we're still trying to get our head around the social inequality part of it, because we're not necessarily finding that there's these clear-cut divisions between males and females. So
Really?
it's a
Okay.
really interesting concept, and I mean, it makes sense as well in terms of thinking about society, and um, it wasn't necessarily a society ruled by men. Do you know what I mean? So
Gee, suddenly we get one
we've
and there's not as much inequality.
we've got some, yeah. So we've got some ideas about what's happening in terms of power structures and gender and that type of thing. They wouldn't have been so distinct, I think, in Southeast Asia in that time period.
Wow. That's so cool because it is. I mean, you're getting all these different cultures and Yeah, I think about, the Indigenous peoples in Canada, and we've been studying it with my daughter. And it's true, though, the cultures that the nations that steered clear of agriculture were ones that tended to be close to the water, lots of, they were strong fishing communities. And then over winter, being able to, hunt larger animals like moose and whatnot that could sustain longer
Yeah,
is what I've
yeah,
read. That's I don't
yeah,
have,
yeah.
but
And I
it
think,
does make sense.
yeah, and when I was talking about before, Neolithic populations and them being sedentary or not, it doesn't always hold true. So we had like pre-Neolithic populations in Thailand that would have been sedentary because they had all those resources there.
Yeah, they don't
So
need to.
even looking at health differences between that time, all the assumptions that we have about various things don't necessarily hold true to different environments.
Yeah.
So it's very context specific, and lots more work needs to be done on that, especially looking at the Neolithic kind of transition.
In these places where you see the sex differences, and I know I've kept you so long, I apologize, but I do have one more question. Hopefully you're okay with it. But when you see sex differences, is it always favoring the male in terms of things in these cultures you found? Have you ever found the contrary, where we've got that sex difference in a society that's like, our girls are getting the best because they need it? I don't know. Does that
Yeah,
pop up
well,
ever?
I think that, I mean, there's been very little work really that's been done in terms of care and gender. So there needs to be more work. Obviously, the studies that I've talked about have shown some preference towards boys, or gender disparity. So that's interesting. It's interesting that you bring that up because I think sometimes the interpretations of some of the bioarchaeological work assumes that girls aren't valued. So there's been work that's been done looking at groups of perinates or of babies within cemetery samples. And there's an argument that because they all died around the time of birth, that they must have been victims of infanticide, which is not
Yeah. Why?
valid because most the normal age of death distribution, you would have a peak in the infant mortality around the time of birth. So that argument's
Yeah. Does it make
very
sense that?
problematic. But they have tried to look to see if there's any bias towards males and females doing ancient DNA work there, because they would assume that the babies that were being killed are boys or girls. So yeah, it's problematic to be able to do that work because ancient DNA analysis sometimes is quite hard. But this new peptide analysis that I was talking about, you can actually look at using very destructive methods. You can look at sexing individuals from the teeth. So we'll be able to look at the really young little babies to look at sex.
Wow. That is so cool. That is like, I love it. This is what I love about this podcast is all this cool stuff I get to learn. I always say, like, I hear about things, I'm like, oh, in another life, I would love to do that. And now I get to. I'm like, I learned about mini puberty. I've learned about now that we're identifying sex for dead babies at like birth there. It is so fascinating. I just thank you so much for sharing all of this today with everyone, because it is, I agree with you. You have to understand our past to know how we got to where we are. And certainly seeing some of the inequalities, even starting earlier, that have persisted for quite a while, but also just the need for parents to know, I mean, take homes for me here for parents right away are, yeah, we need more support and shared care. Clearly, that was part of it. But I still love, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to that breastfeeding, that this idea that it made up such a large portion of their diet up to 2.5, 3, that you could still see it in the analysis, that's what, so many families worry that, and they're told to worry that their kids breastfeeding too much and stuff. And it's like, No, this has
Yeah,
been,
and it's interesting talking with you about it because I hadn't really thought about it in that context. But
yeah,
yes, it does
it's,
so
yeah.
much.
It makes so much sense that is. And when we look at, I mean, we're finally getting some studies that look at, components of breast milk beyond a year. And so, of course, it was a big part of their diet. It is filled with, immunological factors, et cetera, to prevent disease. And they would need that at that age. That's when they start exploring. That's when and I think about it from a perspective of like a social history. And I'm going, well, it seems like it prevents disease and health. There's that health element of the breastfeeding, but I also wonder how much it also keeps wandering little people from going too far. But I do think there's always these dangers that exist in these cultures, and especially hunter gatherer, but even during agricultural periods, kids could roam freer. And it's almost like the breast keeps them it's that invisible tether to say, you're going to want it enough to come back, don't go too far now until you're old enough to understand. Yeah, don't go over there because
Yeah, yeah.
danger.
It's amazing though when you see some of these kids playing around, really, really young kids, but they're with kids that are, it's just a couple of years older,
Yeah.
and they just know how to look after them.
Yeah.
They
It
know
is.
all the dangers. They're always alert,
Yeah.
you know.
And I also love because you can also see from the other perspective how much younger kids learn from older kids. Like we like to talk about adults we model for our kids. I mean, maybe we do. We do. I know that I'm not going to dismiss it entirely, but they learn so much more from other children that it's mind boggling. Like I always say when people talk about socialization, don't get your kid with same age peers. Go pick a couple years older. And those are the people you want your kids spending time with because they are going to soak up. So pick a good person too, because you don't want them soaking up all the wrong things, but they will, like a sponge, absorb that to a degree that, and it's like cultures for most of history seem to have taken advantage of that. That there was like a knowledge that these kids, were more competent, but also caring there. But anyway, that is so. Before we close, can you please tell us where people can find you to read up more on this and papers, your lab, what projects you have going? Not that usually people I'm like, call out for participants. Not going to happen in your case, I don't think. That would be a little weird, a little awkward.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
on Twitter, ancient children. Is that right? I can't remember. um,
but they can look up your name.
if you just Google bioarchaeology of childhood, I've got a website, so you'll be able to look at that in a blog.
And I will share all these in the show notes too. So people will be able, you can get
please.
the link. Just check the show notes below and you'll be able to access all these sites.
Yeah, childhood bioarchaeology.
Yeah.
.org.
It'll be there. Whatever it is, it'll be there. We'll get that. So you have that. And then you put everything up on the blog, I know. Do you have a lab website for the projects and like articles and stuff, or just really your site's the best to go to?
Oh, yeah. So that site links to my university website, but just, Sian Halcrow, and my email is sian.halcrow@otago.ac.nz.
And I'm sure if you're interested in any of these studies, they can email you to ask for some copies to read more about sex differences and everything.
Definitely. And a lot of our work is open access as well. We believe in open access.
Oh, I wish all disciplines did because
but it's a problem because it's the publishers that are making the money then out of us.
Well, that's I always email
open access whenever I can, but when I can't do that, I will distribute it. And I'm on ResearchGate and academia.edu as well.
Okay, yeah, and that's what. Always feel free to reach out to researchers. Yes, and everything will, like I said, all of this stuff will be here. But I just thank you so much for taking the time to share this. This is beyond fascinating, and I am very excited to see what you guys come up with next because I'm excited to see this blend. If you can get people to do the care of infants past as you've proposed, I am very eager to see what comes from that because I feel like more and more we are getting researchers to realize they need this collaborative approach when it comes to these issues. And this one is definitely important to cross disciplines here with everything.
Well, just talking to you, it's been collaborative because I've started to think about how my work is more relevant to parenting today. So it's something that we always need to keep that conversation going about. So
it absolutely is relevant here. So thank you. I hope you really, although I know in the midst of the research, though, it can feel like it's all about the academic element of it because that's what you're immersed in. But please know, yes, hugely relevant for so many people. So thank you so much. And again, check the show notes, everyone. You'll be able to see all of her work. And I strongly urge you to read up more on this and think about your past and how it's affecting you today so that we can all learn from that. That is it for this week's episode, and I want to thank Dr. Sharon Hellcrow again for being tolerant of my ignorance in all of this and answering so many questions, as well as giving us so much to think about for the next little while. I know I will be. I particularly remain amazed by this idea of weaning being about the nutritional element of breastfeeding and not the emotional element, which is crucial to how we think about the nursing relationship overall. Anyway, please join me next week. I have with me Dr. Jenny Rozier. She is a professor of communications at James Madison University, and we will be talking about a paper that we actually co-authored together on the topic of how Cry It Out, the sleep training method, extinction sleep training, became authoritative knowledge, or rather, how we just decided that that is what we all should be doing. So please join me next week for that conversation, and in the meantime, happy parenting.